Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. So, one of the, I think, most intriguing ideas that's come out in the last little while is this idea of a Hyperloop. And I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's something about this vacuum tube that's going to go from Las Vegas to Los Angeles or from Toronto to Montreal, and it's going to whoosh us in a matter of minutes over long distances. And Elon Musk has sponsored some competition where people have been getting involved to try to create this opportunity. And some gentlemen have joined me tonight to educate me on this topic and hopefully educate all of you because I think it's fascinating. So first I've got Nathan Power and Nick Marcial. Is that correct?
Marcial, it's a tough one.
Marcial, I apologize. Nick is the team captain with 3 years on a team for one of these competitions. And Nick is the wheels lead for competition 4 and is currently the suspension testing lead. Nick, you're in mechanical engineering, and Nathan, what are you? I don't have what your background is here.
Mechanical engineering as well.
You're both mechanical engineering, and both of you, where are you doing mechanical engineering?
So I'm based out at St. John's, Newfoundland. I study at the Memorial University, or MON.
Okay.
And I'm based out of Boston, Massachusetts, studying at Northeastern University.
Fantastic. Okay, so what is Hyperloop?
So Hyperloop is basically a conceptual fifth mode of transportation. It kind of works on the premise that if you take away friction, both rolling and air resistance, you can reach much, much higher speeds. So if you think of like airplane conditions, that's really what we're going for with a Hyperloop, but we want it on the ground so that it's accessible. Hyperloop is one of those systems, kind of like a train or a subway, where you can get on and off it very quickly. You don't have these hour-long delays of, I have to go to the airport an hour before my flight. It's on and off very quick, but it has the speeds something like an airplane would. So theoretically, we're going for speeds of about 1,000 kilometers an hour. To put that into perspective, the 3-hour drive from, say, Edmonton to Calgary, you could do in about 30 minutes on a Hyperloop.
1,000 kilometers an hour. Now, a Hyperloop vehicle, is this a personal vehicle, or are you on a bus, or are you on, like 300 people like a plane?
So it would work pretty much like a subway would, where you have almost like a pod is the term that they use for Hyperloop. It's almost like a train car. You can have either cargo or people on board. So the transportation ones for people specifically would be around 30 to 40 people per pod. And then the cargo one is depending on what you're shipping and so forth. But the plan for the Hyperloop is to have a higher frequency than what you would have on a plane, but lower density.
Higher frequency, but lower density. So leaving every, 15 minutes?
Depends on the route. Probably about every 15 minutes or so. It depends on how busy the route is and how many people are going on. Maybe in peak hours, you have more Hyperloop pods, and then lower hours, you might have less.
And this frictionless space, it's created by what? A vacuum?
A vacuum or near vacuum. So unfortunately, we can't get a perfect vacuum in engineering, but we try to get as low as we can. So we get as close to a vacuum as we can, or low pressure, and then that way you don't have air resistance. So if you think of a plane where you're up in much, much higher altitudes, you don't have as much air pressure. And that's why planes can go much faster, because they don't have that friction. So Hyperloop takes that concept, but it also takes the concept of rolling resistance. So one of the limiting factors on why trains can only go as fast as they can is the rolling resistance of the wheels themselves. Hyperloop doesn't have wheels. Instead, it levitates. Right now, it looks like it's going to be magnetic levitation. So if you can levitate those pods and there's no air resistance, that's why you can go to those ridiculous speeds of 1,000 kilometers an hour.
So I went on a maglev train in Shanghai, and I think it was going, 300, 400 kilometers an hour. It was pretty cool. And I think it was like 8 or 10 seats across. It was really quite wide. And it took what was a 45-minute drive down to 8 minutes from the airport to the sort of not downtown Shanghai, but close to Shanghai. So that's effectively what you're talking about, but in a tunnel rather than on a monorail kind of structure that I was on, correct?
It's like a maglev in a tunnel, so you don't have the air resistance that you have on a maglev.
Fantastic. And so you've explained Hyperloop. What are you two guys doing?
So we compete in the SpaceX Hyperloop pod competition, which was started about 5 years ago. Elon Musk published a white paper back, I think it was in 2013, basically said, hey, I have this cool idea for a new mode of transportation. But we all know that Elon Musk, although super rich, he is super busy. So we basically coined the concept of having a student competition. So SpaceX hosts this student competition every year, and it's a great opportunity for not only us to develop Hyperloop technology, but we also get to contribute to our professional development through building these tangible products.
And so what is it exactly that you're doing?
So we build
What are you
prototype
building?
Hyperloop pods. We build like smaller scale Hyperloop pods, and then we take these prototypes down to LA and we race them on a 1 mile long track.
Awesome. And where are you building the pod? In Massachusetts or in Newfoundland?
The last pod was built in Newfoundland. Pods before that were partially built in both locations, but most of the building has been out of Newfoundland for the past couple of years.
Unbelievable. This sounds like just a fascinating thing for you guys to be involved in. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Nathan and Nick in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're talking Hyperloop tonight with Nathan Power from Newfoundland and Nicholas Marcial from Boston, Massachusetts. Both mechanical engineering students. They're involved in an Elon Musk competition to produce not the Hyperloop, but the Hyperloop pods. So that the tube, I guess, is where, down in Vegas somewhere?
Actually, in Los Angeles, in Hawthorne.
It's in Los Angeles. I thought it went from Los Angeles to Vegas, so it's a shorter tunnel than I thought, right?
Yeah, it's shorter. It's about a 1/4 mile long, and it actually sits at the SpaceX headquarters, right next to a Costco.
Okay, right. Good to know. And so you're building this pod, and this pod that you're building, does it have seats for 30 people in it, or what is it that you're building?
So because the pods that we're building are essentially a scaled down model where we're trying to validate the systems themselves, we don't actually have any seating that we put in those. In the fully scaled up system, you would put the seating and the internal ventilation in the systems to make sure that people can have a safe and enjoyable ride.
What's your propulsion?
Yeah, so our propulsion from year to year has varied. We originally had a system where we had air skate levitation, and we had a pusher system provided for that. And in Comp 4, our most recent competition, we actually used an electric motor to a direct drivetrain with wheels.
But Nathan was telling me one of the big benefits was no wheels. So why are you putting wheels in?
That's right. So part of this competition is to further kind of the systems level technology for these models and to draw inspiration on the research and development. So the student teams compete to develop these full models. And within the constraints of trying to achieve the fastest speed, the best time, and the most stable system in the competition, you can go the route of a traditional electric motor with wheels. But as they start to scale the project fully, that's when they want to actually reduce the system to magnetic levitation.
So I thought that these things were like vacuum tubes, and you were propelled by a vacuum. That's not correct. So you have a propulsion with an electrical motor on the pod itself?
Correct. And the vacuum pressurization doesn't actually propel the vehicle. It's just that to minimize drag, they try and pull the tube to near vacuum.
Oh, really? So I was, imagining these, you guys are way too young, but you used to have these little tubes that would take messages through it that were, what are they called? Pneumatic tubes or something like
Right.
this. And they were vacuum, and the vacuum was what pulled and created the propulsion. That's what that's what I had thought you were creating. That's not the case. So you're actually going to have vacuum to reduce the friction, but then your propulsion is by some other motor.
Some other internal method, exactly.
So it's like they're going to be a jet engine at the back of one of these things?
That wouldn't necessarily be the best idea given that you're in closed quarters and you'd have some gas concerns there.
So this electrical motor is doing what?
So the electric motor is driving, essentially, in the case of our competition 4 pod, a drive belt, which goes to a wheel system, which is just a direct drive propulsion method. And the friction of the wheel gripping the track is enough to propel the entire mass.
Okay. So once you get to a maglev, how are you going to then propel?
Yeah, so the way that magnetic levitation works is essentially you have these magnetic rails and you have the systems built to control the stability of the vehicle. And so you wouldn't actually be initiating the forward motion through this magnetic levitation, hence the kicker or the initiator that was provided in previous competitions.
So the kicker is the electrical motor. The maglev is just a way of levitating. Is that correct?
So the maglev is just a way of levitating. It is, whereas the motor would be a way of internally propelling this vehicle. And so with magnetic levitation, you would need another device external to the vehicle to propel.
So in that case, you could use something like a linear induction motor, which is I think is what's used in maglev nowadays. So you have the magnetic levitation that Nick was talking about that gets you up off the, say, the track itself. And then a linear induction motor is basically a series of electrical coils that are wound, and then you have magnets in the track itself. And it kind of works like a big electric motor would. If you send the current through it, you're going to get opposing forces. And if you send the right currents at the right time, you're going to get forward propulsion that you would have like in the maglev that you were talking about before.
So it's a magnet created by these electrical coils that's attracting you or pulling you forward?
Exactly. So it's a magnetic field, and that difference in magnetic field, say if you took like two magnets, one that's north and one that's south, and you push them together, they're going to push themselves apart. So if you can recreate that through like a stationary magnet and then a coil by sending a current through it, that's how you get that forward momentum.
And that kind of magnets that repel each other can get something going 1,000 kilometers an hour?
Yep.
Unbelievable.
So if you also consider the fact that, as mentioned before, you're levitating, there's no rolling resistance, then there's no air resistance, there's very, very minimal force that's actually going to be slowing you down. It's kind of like the concept of, you've probably heard before, if you let something go in space, theoretically it's going to go forever because there's nothing pushing against it. So if you can minimize the forces going against the vehicle, you can go much faster with lower energy input.
Okay, so how do you stop it?
Similar way that you would go forward. So if your motor is pushing you forward, you send the current in the opposite direction, then it's going to slow you down. Where you slow down how much current is going in, it's going to slow down.
And then do you need some wheels to stop it from crashing into the bottom of the tunnel?
That's up to the individual manufacturer. From what I've heard from some companies, they're going to have some sort of landing system, as you would say, like on a plane. So you would go so long on the wheels, and then like a plane, you take your wheels up once you're levitating, you do your route, and then once you're going to land, say again, even if it's a small gap, then you would have those landing wheels come out again. They might be deployable, they might be there all the time as redundancy, but there would be some type of wheel for the beginning and end phase is how I envision it, but it's really up to the individual designer there.
And when you're talking about this tunnel, what's the kind of diameter that we're thinking about?
Off the top of my head, I would say that the one in Hawthorne that we use is probably 6 feet, I would say, Nick. I don't know.
5, 6 feet. Yeah.
It's not. That's just a test.
Big. That's just a test one. Once you get into like the full scale ones, probably about the size of like a subway tunnel would be.
A subway tunnel. Okay, so when people were talking about high-speed rail between Toronto and Montreal, as an example, the issue is just getting the right-of-ways, and that there's so much congestion, and where do you build it, and how do you build it? And I've been on some of the high-speed trains in Taiwan, as an example, or in France, as an example, and you get to a lot of parts of the country, they're all up on these big cement towers up in the sky because that's the only place they could actually put them. And then when they get into the suburban and urban parts of Paris, as an example, because it's so congested and there's so many turns, they actually slow down to be comparable to sort of conventional trains. What are you guys thinking about in, say, a Toronto, Montreal, or a Las Vegas, Los Angeles kind of scenario?
Right.
You go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, the beauty of many of the proposals that have been tossed up is that they take into account routes that go under the ground. So a big proposition has been that you would essentially have a checkpoint in your major cities, right, trying to connect, for example, Vegas and Los Angeles. And you would be able to, in the case of the concept of transporting cars or humans from station to station, you would be able to have these stations in the cities and be able to get the clearance underneath all of your houses, underneath all of your commercial buildings and your highways. In addition, there have been plans proposed for, as you alluded to, having these tubes on concrete pylons. And to minimize the congestion of having a new route being placed, through these areas, the idea is that you would actually run these parallel to interstates. And so you get a combination of underground, above ground on pylons, and tunneled through hills and mountains.
And does the altitude of these things change, or do you think about a train, you want to keep it very flat and you don't want to have a big slope? What's the impact on your tunnels? Do they have to be reasonably flat?
They have to be reasonably flat in inflection, right? So if I want to go down by 1,000 feet in the next 500 miles, right? I'm not going to do a sharp drop at one single point, right? Because, for obvious reasons, the stability of the system. But I'm going to instead gradually slope that down. And you'll notice too that if I'm trying to connect Vegas to Los Angeles, for example, right, there's going to be elevation changes along the peaks and valleys of that route. And so that's where you're going to see something that might be underground for a 50-mile stretch might appear towering in the sky in another 50-mile stretch, if the best objective determined by the designer is to keep it as straight as possible.
So I'm not sure what the statistics you guys are looking at are, but some rough order of numbers for subways in Toronto is that subways are something like 4 times the cost of something on the ground, and something that's elevated is like 1.5 times the cost of something on the ground. So building a sky train above, or a monorail above, is more expensive than being on the ground, but has the benefit of great separation and faster transit, etc. But going underground is incredibly expensive because of the cost of tunneling. And you're calling us from Boston, Massachusetts. I can't remember the number, but it was something like the big dig was like $18 billion or something like that to sink the Green Monster that used to be the highway that went around, the elevated highway that went around the bottom of Boston, Massachusetts. Tunneling is unbelievably expensive.
Yes.
Can you make it cost justify if you have to tunnel?
For sure. So one of the avenues that we're actually exploring in Paradigm right now, the team, is this new tunneling competition that has been tossed up by the Boring Company, slated for next summer in 2021. And it's kind of a perfect setup going on in Hawthorne, where you have the Boring Company position right next to SpaceX, and they're ultimately trying to drive down exponentially the time it takes to tunnel these subway-sized tunnels. They have a proof tunnel with a track laid, and if you've seen the recent Tesla keynote where they launched, I believe it was a Model X or a Model S through that tunnel, you can start to see where, okay, we're getting into conversations about this viability, and so it's more going to be a conversation about economies of scale and trying to make that tunneling technology particularly faster, and that will drive the cost down.
What are the other things that you're working on to make this applicable? You're working on the propulsion, you're working on the maglev, you're working on the tunneling. What are the other components that need to be thought through?
Yeah, so the power systems is very important, right? So you have to have a very powerful battery pack, and you have to have battery management. You have to have safety mitigations, right? So you have to have telemetry. You have to have all these controls. You have to have the software that supports that. You also need to make sure that you have a robust braking system. Nathan mentioned the deceleration of the linear induction system and coming to a stop with some sort of landing, gear. And that would be the fully scaled up version of what we've done, for example, in Competition 4, which was where we had standard pneumatic brakes. So that kind of thing has to be taken into account. In addition to your frame, how stable is your frame? You need good suspension, just like a traditional car, to make sure that you're not going lopsided or pitching too far up and down, because we're dealing with very extreme accelerations, almost twice those of most roller coasters, commercial roller coasters. So a lot of systems to take into account.
I got to tell you, I did ride on that maglev train in Shanghai I mentioned earlier, and it was faster than a roller coaster, and a whole bunch of people were on it, riding it just for the fun of it. It was I think it was there on a Saturday or Sunday, and there were a whole bunch of people that just were going back and forth in the airport for the fun of being on this unbelievably fast train that was traveling. It was pretty cool. So you talk about all these different component parts that need to be built. You guys are part of one team. How many teams are involved?
The latest numbers I've heard for the last competition was something like 1,200 applicants were in the running for the student team. That's for the student competition itself. Now, how accurate that number is, I'm not 100% sure, because SpaceX doesn't disclose how many applications they do get. The way that the competition works, they get as many applications, whether it be 1,200, like in past years, and then they have a series of submissions. So we submit our design documents periodically throughout the year, and then they gradually cut that number down. So for your initial say, preliminary design package, you might have 100 teams that are in the running. For the competition itself, when we actually travel down to California, there's 22 other teams. So that's 22 of the best teams that SpaceX and the Boring Company have handpicked to come down to California to test their Hyperloop pods.
Unbelievable. Nathan Power and Nicholas Marcel, thanks so much for sharing this with us. We're going to take a break and come back more with these two guys in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting with Nathan Power from Newfoundland and Nicholas Marcel from Boston, Massachusetts. We're talking Hyperloop, which is this tube that's going to run from Toronto, Montreal, or from Vegas to Los Angeles, or from Calgary to Edmonton, or I don't know where. And it's going to put us in a tube, and it's going to take us 1,000 kilometers an hour. Guys, Toronto to Montreal, any idea how long that would be?
I guess I think it's about a half hour, 25 minutes is the numbers I've heard.
That's unbelievable. Like the travel has got to go up dramatically. Now, in a world of COVID-19, when we're all staying at home, maybe it's game over for Hyperloop.
I would actually argue the opposite. Hyperloop is actually designed in a way that would be very ideal for pandemics. Of course, we've seen in the past couple of weeks that public transportation has taken a massive hit. If you look at aviation numbers and public transportation, nobody's taking it nowadays because obviously of social distancing. The way that Hyperloop plans on working, it's not going to be as densely populated as a plane. You're not going to have hundreds of people on it. Instead, the way that Hyperloop is going to be designed, at least from the initial renderings and stuff I've seen so far from commercial applications, it's going to be like 30 to 40 people on these pods or train-like structures. And as mentioned before, you're going to have much more frequent Hyperloop routes. So instead of like a plane, for example, you might have 300 people a couple times a day. You would have a Hyperloop pod with 30 to 40 people, and it might be a dozen times a day. So you have the people much more spread out, which enables social distancing much easier.
So what's the future of Hyperloop? Do you think it's going to happen? When are we going to have the first person get in one of these things and go from LA to Vegas?
That's a tricky question because there's so many people working on it. I would say right now, if you looked at the numbers for some of the leaders like Virgin Hyperloop One, they're quoting that they're going to have at least a test track that people can ride on by like 2030. Now, of course, with COVID-19, there might be some delays in their development. My fingers are crossed that we're going to see something that we can ride on around 2030. But of course, we have to accommodate the fact that there's going to be a lot of government regulations that follow with Hyperloop. It's not just a matter of building the track and building the infrastructure. You have to make sure that it's safe for people to ride on. Same like airplanes, there's regulations, government regulations around airplanes that have taken years, if not decades, to develop. So a similar case is going to have to happen with Hyperloop.
Yeah, and in addition, you're also going to see time required to set up these stations, to actually design and construct these stations, the surrounding infrastructure. In addition, right, as you start to commercialize, this technology and really get it, widespread, the first couple of people that are going to be able to purchase a ticket are going to be some high ballers. And that's because you need to offset a lot of the infrastructure costs and the back end expenses before you can, before Nathan or I can hop on and pay a $50 ticket.
So is this going to be just for the rich, or is this going to be for the masses?
It will eventually be for the masses, 100%. At the very beginning, it's most likely going to be that the people that are actually developing and testing these systems are actually sitting in it themselves for user validation, and then you would get into economies of scale. Again, this issue, right, where it would be primarily people that can afford a pretty hefty price ticket to go round trip or one way. And as you start to see more of a governmental kind of influx of money to support the stations and to actually get the power to these stations and to the actual lines, and it becomes a more frequent topic of conversation. Through economies of scale, you'll see a cost comparable, if not slightly cheaper than a cheap airline ticket.
Right now, we are contemplating a high-speed train that would go from Quebec City to Windsor, for an example. I know Amtrak has been doing a lot of things to try to speed up your train system from Boston to Washington. If these Hyperloops are 10 years away, should we be investing in high-speed trains, or no, just wait to Hyperloop?
I think it is absolutely necessary to invest in these high-speed trains. And once again, I'll just put this out there. This is my opinion, my personal opinion. You have these public systems that are already put in place. In the case of where I'm at in Boston, you have the MBTA system. We all know here, if you're from here, that the MBTA system is extremely expensive to upkeep, and they do maintenance pretty much every year on the carts and the track. And so that's, millions, if not billions of dollars in tax money. But the reality is that you have these neighborhoods, and you also have these, low-income neighborhoods especially, and you have to connect the economic hubs of the city to the residential hubs of the city to provide this continuous public service. So it would be unrealistic to say, hey, cease fire on the current infrastructure and just focus on Hyperloop. It should be that more government investment is going into the Hyperloop in addition to looking at cost-effective ways of maintaining these pre-existing systems.
What do you think, Nathan?
I think the key for Hyperloop adoption is definitely to hold off a little bit until the technology itself is proven. So us students, we've done it on like a prototype scale. We've proven that the individual components, like Nick was talking about before, the brakes, the motors, all those components, is that we can use existing technology and leverage that to build Hyperloop. I think the next step is then taking those prototypes that we've built and basically retrofitting them for people to ride on. As we mentioned before, we didn't design the Hyperloop pods for people to ride on. The product that you designed for a high-speed race in Los Angeles for SpaceX competition, and the type of product that you design for people to get on and off dozens of times a day are two very different design challenges. So the factors that you have to take into account there are very different. So companies like Transpod and Virgin Hyperloop One, they're now at that stage now where it's like, okay, we know Hyperloop can work as a technology. How do we now make it safe for people to ride on? How do we now make it efficient? And as Nick mentioned before, how do we make it cost effective? Of course, it's a basic business principle. If it's not cost effective, it doesn't make sense to build it, no matter how fast it can go or how grand of a technology it is. If we can't get the cost down, it's not going to make sense. So I think it's really key that we acknowledge that there's going to be a very large initial infrastructure cost, but the actual operating cost of the Hyperloop, since it's not run by gasoline, it's all electric. There's very little maintenance needed for the Hyperloop. Once the track is built, it's built, it's there. It's not like it's a highway where it's exposed to weather conditions. It's an enclosed tube. So the actual maintenance cost of the Hyperloop compared to other modes of transportation is going to be much lower. And that's why over the next 20 to 30 years, once it's actually built, you're going to see that cost go down dramatically.
These tubes that or tunnels that run, and let's just use for ease of simplicity, hopefully you guys are familiar with the geography, but Montreal to Toronto as an example. If you're doing a high-speed rail, one of the complaints that the rail companies have is if they got to stop in Oshawa and Belleville and Kingston and Gananoque, that it doesn't become a high-speed rail anymore. And so what's going to happen with Hyperloop? Are you going to go all the way from Toronto to Montreal, or are you going to be able to stop 4 or 5 times in the middle?
Yeah, that's definitely a really good question. And it more so relates to like, what is the best use of the Hyperloop? So personally, I see the Hyperloop as basically in those distances that it's almost too short. You don't want to take a plane, but it's too long that you want to drive. So those like interstate distances, Toronto to Montreal would be a good one. Say Edmonton to Calgary, or San Francisco to Los Angeles. And it's mostly just a basic principle of, okay, can you get up to your top speed, and can you stay there long enough that it makes sense? Where the Hyperloop is projected to go to speeds of 1,000, 1,200 kilometers an hour, really doesn't make sense to be stopping every 5 minutes if you're accounting for that acceleration and deceleration. So if you're going a couple hundred kilometers, 300, 400 kilometers, that's when it starts to make a bit of economic sense for sure.
Do you pull off to the side? Is there a side track, or no? It's you're stopping right there in the track, in the tunnel.
So that entirely depends on who would be constructing or who received the contract, right, for this route. Proposals have been made to sidetrack a section of the track and replace it in position with the new pod that is entering. So, for example, me and 10 of my buddies are stopping at Los Angeles at the station. Our track would pull to the left. It would slide a track from, say, the right from another, substation with another 10 new passengers to go back to San Francisco. There have also been systems proposed where there's just a single endpoint. You get off and you rotate and flip back, and those who are boarding get on that. And that leaves a little bit less room for multiple stations kind of converging into a single tube. Once again, there have been stations proposed for having multiple tubes dropped off. a single tube. It really depends on who is building it.
How did you guys get involved in this?
I started back in first year. Joined basically 2 or 3 weeks into my undergrad degree. Throughout high school and stuff like that, I was always pretty heavily involved in student teams and volunteering and all that kind of stuff. So when I went to university, it was kind of like, okay, I'm going to continue with some projects and stuff like that. But now that I was in engineering, I wanted something that was a bit more tangible, maybe a bit more technical, and something that was related to what I was working on. So I found out about Hyperloop pretty early on. At this stage, this was just after the second competition, when Paradigm played second. So there was a lot of buzz and hype around the team as it was. But there was also a lot of people at that time that wanted to join the team since we had performed that well. So it was definitely a little bit of a challenge to get up to speed, because there's a steep learning curve when you're coming right out of high school and then you want to design a Hyperloop pod. So it was fun in that aspect. I definitely learned a lot early on in my undergrad. But yeah, just looking for something to work on that was technical and related to engineering was like the main driving factor for me.
Nick?
Yeah, and for me, it was a very similar path where, so I actually didn't know that I wanted to do engineering until pretty late in high school. I got involved through the first robotics competition here in the States, and I took on some leadership positions, and I knew that when I came into Northeastern, I wanted to pursue a similar, project-based engineering team. And I had been following Elon's kind of brainchild projects since my sophomore year of high school. And at that time, it was really about, proof testing concepts still for SpaceX, Tesla, and this Hyperloop concept. And so coming in and recognizing that this Hyperloop club existed, it was an immediate jump in for me. And I haven't looked back since. This has definitely been a thrill for sure.
So these competitions work. They excite guys like you. You get involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so the actual process of the competition, as I mentioned before, there's that series of submissions throughout the year. So we normally start designing throughout the summer. Competitions take place in the summer, so we'll take a couple of weeks off as a breather, and then we'll go back into design work. The initial preliminary design packages, which is like a 30-page slide deck, that's just like an overview for SpaceX engineers to get an idea of what we're going for. That's normally due around October. And then we have a full design package, which is your 200 to 300 page document, all your engineering analysis. That goes in January time. A couple of weeks later, you'll have a safety briefing, and then you actually, over those course of the months in between, you build and test your Hyperloop pod as much as you can. You bring it down to California, and then you race it on the test track.
Nicholas, I think I see a big trophy in behind you. What's that for?
Oh, that's actually my lamp.
So it looks like a trophy, but it's just a lamp. Okay, sorry. Nathan, I think I see a bunch of guitars back there. Are you a guitarist?
Yes, I am. I actually was going to go to music school before I changed my mind 2 weeks before the audition to go into engineering. Always been passionate about music throughout high school and stuff like that. Started playing guitar when I was about 15, and now there's, I think, 6 sitting in my room. So it's a side hobby at this point for sure.
Awesome. Well, guys, I think it's absolutely fascinating that you're involved in this. Let me ask you one last question. Is this the right solution for transportation, or is there something else that you guys have seen that you dream about?
I think Hyperloop is the right solution for the given use case. So I mentioned before, there are awkward distances in transportation systems now. You don't want to take a train, you don't want to take a plane, or you don't want to drive because it's either too long or it's too short or it's too expensive. Nobody really wants to drive from Toronto to Montreal and sit in traffic for half the time, and it's a 3 to 4 hour drive, but you don't want to bother to go to the airport an hour before your flight and then pay a couple $100 when you're only on the plane for 40 minutes. So if you had something like the Hyperloop where you could do that distance in a half hour, but it only takes you 2 to 3 minutes to onboard and offboard, and you're right in the heart of the city afterwards, that's, for me, is really where Hyperloop lies. There's a lot of really good applications for it distance-wise. A couple of interstate routes throughout the States would make a lot of sense. I think Europe would be a really ideal use case for it as well. You have these closely connected cities that are a little bit too far away for a plane. You don't really want to drive. So I think that's really where the key, that's where it slots in the hole for Hyperloop, is that those awkward distances.
Yeah, I couldn't echo Nathan more. I think that in terms of residential, commercial purposes of traveling from point to point, it is the best comparable option among all of them for future projections in terms of comparing what we have, right? So cars, boats, commercial airliners, etc. And there have even been proposals for transcontinental connections as well. I think a couple technologies that I personally find interesting in the transportation space are supersonic commercial flight. as well as the advent of electric turbine commercial airliners. But if we're talking, for the sole purpose of going from Los Angeles to San Francisco in, a 30, 45-minute time span, this is the place to be.
Nicholas, tell me about supersonic flight for a second. I had the pleasure of flying the Concorde a few times from New York to Paris. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, no, it's really cool. So supersonic flight, essentially, very basically the way it works is there's something called a sound barrier and something called a Mach number. If you have a plane which achieves a speed which exceeds its Mach number, which is just a ratio, then you start to see these streaks break out in certain drag cases, and you get that boom, and now you're in supersonic flight, right? So we've seen this in military applications, and now they're trying to safely propose that kind of, certain startups are trying to safely propose that kind of technology for, your flight from Boston to Miami.
Do you think it'll happen?
I can see it happening in a similar way that I can see the Hyperloop happening, where, right, we need this proof testing, we need the safety, and we need the regulation in place. We need economic saturation of competition to make sure that it's cost effective. And then I can see it happen.
What about space flight? Is it going to happen?
For sure. I mean, if you look at what's happening nowadays with SpaceX, right? It looks like straight out of Star Wars. If you've ever seen the Star Wars movies, you've got these reusable rocket stages, which are touching back down on these little concrete islands in the middle of the ocean with extreme accuracy. That's something I never imagined I would see as a child myself, and I'm a pretty young guy. So I think that in terms of commercialization, that is the future avenue for space flight, and I think we're going to see another Kennedy end of the 1960s-esque space race coming very soon.
Nathan, other than Hyperloop, what technology excites you the most?
That's a tough one. I don't know if I could pick one. I'm going to go with a simple answer and just say electric cars. It's something that's fascinated me since probably I was a small kid. The idea that the way that we look at cars nowadays is not the most efficient way to go about it. And the fact that there's going to be a revolution, in my opinion, of the automobile industry within the next couple of years. We've seen the rapid growth of companies like Tesla. There's a bunch of startups that are now following them. We've quickly started to realize that it's, of course, climate change is the main driving factor there, but it's also a matter of you can get higher performing cars and they operate much cheaper. I think that's definitely the most exciting thing for me as a young engineer. That's the avenue that I can see developing and going up to a larger scale within even the next couple of years. We're seeing a massive boom in it for sure.
What's the next stage for you guys in your competition?
Next stage is the Boring Company competition. So as mentioned before, that's the avenue that we're going down now. SpaceX decided to take a little bit of a step back this year. They said that they're going to be designing and building a new test track for us because we have this 1 mile long test track, and we're kind of getting to the point where we're reaching the speeds we can't go any faster. There's only so fast that you can safely go in 1 mile and stop and not break out the other side. So what we're focusing on instead is this Boring Company competition. It's called Not a Boring Competition. A little bit of a play on word there, but essentially it's a very similar format to the Hyperloop competition, except that it's also with professional teams, so students can work alongside professional engineers and companies, and the main goal is to build tunnels as fast as we can. So for the past couple of years, we've been working on the Hyperloop pods themselves, and I think we've really contributed to that space, and now we're focusing alongside Hyperloop. We're going to be still working on a couple of projects, but we're going to be focusing on, okay, how do we make the best tunnels, the cheapest and fastest?
Well, if you guys have some great breakthrough in tunneling and you're going to get to that next stage in the competition, give me a call back. I want to hear about how you do, okay?
Absolutely. We'd love to chat again.
Nathan Power and Nicholas Marcia, thank you so much for joining us. Good luck with your Hyperloop competition, particularly in it's not a boring competition. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Well, that's the show for tonight. Really, I'm fascinated by the whole idea of Hyperloop, and I really quite enjoyed Nicholas talking about supersonic flight and Nathan talking about electrical cars, because I agree with them that those are two huge opportunities. I tell you, taking the Concorde from North America to Europe in half the time that it takes a conventional airplane was pretty exciting. And I think that if we can solve the climate change problems, I think 40% or so of greenhouse gases are caused by transportation. If we can solve climate change to a certain extent by improving our transportation with electrical cars, it'll be great. I just wish we could have these guys talk to us far more about so many more technologies like autonomous vehicles and light rail transit and SkyTrains and things like that. Maybe we'll have to get them to recommend some of their other competitor teams to talk to us about it. Anyway, that's the show for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Brian Crombie on the Brian Crombie Radio, or every Monday through Friday on 690 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, or you can get all my podcasts and video casts after the fact on my website, briancrombie.com. Thanks, Nathan. Thanks, Nicholas. Appreciate you joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Hi, Brian Crombie here, Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've got a few minutes left, and I thought I couldn't let this moment in history pass without mentioning it. This past weekend, we lost two incredible human beings. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Supreme Court Justice, someone who you couldn't help but follow her career, some of the unbelievably important things that she has argued for civil liberties, for women's rights, for against anti-abortionists, et cetera, in the United States. And then also John Turner, former Prime Minister of Canada, on the weekend. I grew up in Montreal. My parents were involved in Montreal society when John Turner was a young lawyer in Montreal. And my father worked for IBM. John Turner's wife worked at IBM. And so they were in some of the same social circles. And we heard all the stories at the time about John Turner and how he was destined for greatness within Canadian politics. In 1968, I went and heard both John Turner and Pierre Elliott Trudeau speak. What a great opportunity. In 1984, I worked on the leadership campaign for John Turner in a very small way, but was unbelievably impressed with the work that he did as finance minister during the Trudeau government. Thought that he was one of the key parts of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau government. I think that during the early 1970s, during the War Measures Act and during the time period when some people on Bay Street and in Quebec had lost confidence in Pierre Elliott Trudeau, John Turner was one of the reasons why they stayed. And then in 1988, I was at Harvard Business School, and I did a mini thesis on the Canadian Free Trade Agreement and studied the Royal Macdonald Commission that had produced 26 volumes about free trade and the desire for it, but also argued very strenuously for a guaranteed annual income and transitional adjustment assistance, because what it said was free trade was going to be very good for some people, but very damaging to a lot of other people, and that we needed some assistance. And I wrote that paper and loved the research, and I had the opportunity to interview numerous different people. I interviewed former NDP Premier Barrett from British Columbia. I interviewed numerous different people that were at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And I had an opportunity to talk to the leader of the official opposition at the time, John Turner. And it was an incredible opportunity. And then during the 1988 election, John Turner staked his career and probably his political reputation on being anti-free trade. And he argued very strenuously about how for 120 years we had had this east-west and up to the Arctic structure of our gravity within Canada, but that Brian Mulroney, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, with the free trade agreement, was going to give us a north-south gravitational pull into the United States orbit, and argued strenuously against the lack of jurisdiction that we had, the rights that we had to make independent decisions, that they were going to be made by arbitration boards and the like. He didn't win that election, but he changed a lot of people's minds and almost changed the election. The polls moved dramatically. And it's interesting because two leadership debates that he was in with former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, both the 1984 election, was it 84 election, when he was on the receiving end of an incredible comment by Brian Mulroney that cost him votes big time. And then the leadership debate in 1988, where he gave better than he got. to Brian Mulroney in regards to Brian Mulroney's free trade agreement, really showed how debates are so critical in Canadian politics, showed in 1988 his backbone and how he stood tall, even though in the end he lost. And I got to tell you, I've studied the free trade agreement a fair amount, both during that mini thesis I did at Harvard and then subsequently. What a lot of people forget is that the Canadian dollar went from par to about 67 cents or something like that by the early 1990s. And so therefore, we actually did go through a major wage and price reduction of, order of magnitude 30% that allowed us to adjust to the Canadian-U.S. free trade agreement. And I am convinced that if we had not had that standard of living, wage, and price reduction because of the depreciation, the dramatic depreciation in the Canadian dollar at the time, we would have needed some of those things that the Macdonald-Royal Commission and John Turner were arguing for in a guaranteed annual income and transitional adjustment assistance. Anyway, what an incredible career. Prime Minister of Canada, Justice Minister, numerous other portfolios, and Finance Minister, and probably, other than maybe Paul Martin, probably one of the best, if not the best, prime finance ministers we've ever had in the history of Canada. So rest in peace, John Turner and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I hope to invite some friends of mine onto my show to talk about each one of them in the future. Thank you. That's the Brian Crombie Radio Hour for tonight. Good night.